The elevator lurched to a stop between the second and third floors with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through my bones. For a moment I stood there in the sudden stillness, grocery bags cutting into my palms, waiting for the familiar hum of machinery to resume. When nothing happened, I pressed the button for the third floor again. Then again. The panel of numbers stared back at me, unresponsive and mocking. "Come on," I muttered, pressing every button I could reach. The elevator remained stubbornly motionless, suspended in the space between where I was and where I wanted to be, which felt like a particularly cruel metaphor for my entire existence. I had lived in this building for 4 years, and in all that time, the elevator had never failed me. It was old and slow and made concerning noises, but it had always eventually delivered me to my 5th-floor apartment, where I could disappear behind a locked door and pretend the outside world didn't exist. Now, apparently, even that small reliability had abandoned me. That's when I heard the voice from above. "Hello? Is someone in there?" The voice was deep, warm, tinged with concern. I looked up at the small gap between the elevator ceiling and the shaft wall, where I could see a sliver of light from the third-floor landing. "Yeah," I called back, feeling foolish. "I'm stuck." "Hold on. I'm going to call the emergency number." I heard footsteps moving away, then returning a few minutes later. "They said it'll be about an hour before someone can get here," the voice said. "Are you okay?" "Do you need anything?" "An hour." I shifted the grocery bags in my hands, feeling the plastic handles digging deeper into my skin. One bag held a carton of milk and frozen vegetables that would definitely be room temperature by the time I got out of here. The other held a single-serving frozen dinner and a bottle of wine, the dinner of someone who had given up on the pretense of cooking for himself. "I'm fine," I lied. "My name's Daniel, by the way. I live in 3A. Daniel from 3A. I had seen him in passing over the years, glimpses in the hallway, the sound of his door closing as I climbed the stairs on the rare occasions when the elevator was out of service for maintenance. He was older than me, maybe mid-40s, with graying temples and the kind of solid build that suggested he took care of himself. We had never spoken beyond polite nods, but I had always been aware of him in the way you're aware of attractive people who exist at the edges of your life. "I'm Alex," I said. 5B. "Alex from 5B. He repeated it like he was filing the information away. "I've seen you around. You're the one who always takes the stairs 2 at a time." The fact that he had noticed something so mundane about me was both embarrassing and oddly touching. I did take the stairs 2 at a time, but only because I was usually trying to avoid exactly this kind of interaction with neighbors. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Guilty," I said. "Nothing wrong with being in a hurry." I used to be like that too. There was something wistful in the way he said "used to be," like he was describing a different person entirely. I found myself curious about what had changed, what had slowed him down. "What changed?" I asked, surprising myself. I wasn't usually one for personal questions, especially not with virtual strangers. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if I had overstepped. But then he spoke again, his voice softer than before. I realized I wasn't running toward anything, just away from sitting still long enough to think. The honesty in his admission hit me unexpectedly hard. That was exactly what I had been doing for years, moving fast enough to stay ahead of my own thoughts, keeping busy enough to avoid confronting the growing emptiness that seemed to expand every time I stopped moving. "And now?" I asked. "Now I sit still. Sometimes I even think." I could hear the smile in his voice. "It's terrifying but less exhausting than running all the time." I shifted position, trying to find a way to stand that didn't make my back ache. The elevator felt smaller than it had when I'd first stepped inside, the walls pressing in as the reality of being trapped settled over me. "Are you claustrophobic?" Daniel asked, as if he could sense my growing discomfort. "Not usually." but I've never been stuck in an elevator before. Want to talk? It might help pass the time. The offer was casual, but there was something in his tone that suggested it was motivated by more than just politeness. He sounded like someone who understood what it meant to need distraction from your own thoughts. Okay, I said, settling my grocery bags on the floor and leaning against the back wall of the elevator. What do you want to talk about? Anything. Everything. What do you do for work? I'm a librarian at the university. Reference desk, mostly. I paused, then added, It's not as exciting as it sounds. Daniel laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to fill the elevator shaft. I don't think anyone expects librarian to be an exciting career description, but I bet it's more interesting than you give it credit for. What kind of questions do people ask? Everything you can imagine. Yesterday, someone wanted to know the average lifespan of a medieval monk. Last week, it was the mating habits of sea otters. Students doing research projects, professors fact-checking obscure details, random people who wandered in off the street with burning questions about topics I'd never considered. Do you like it? The question caught me off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked me whether I liked my job that I had to actually think about the answer. I do, actually. There's something satisfying about helping people find what they're looking for, even when they're not entirely sure what that is. Plus, I like the quiet. Libraries are peaceful places. Peaceful is good. I spent 20 years in a career that was the opposite of peaceful, and I'm still recovering. What did you do? Investment banking. High stress, high stakes, high everything except job satisfaction. Daniel's voice took on a bitter edge. I was good at it, made a lot of money, hated every minute of it. Took me until I was 40 to admit that success wasn't worth feeling dead inside. What do you do now? I'm a woodworker. Custom furniture, mostly. Cabinets, bookshelves, things that last. The warmth returned to his voice when he talked about his current work. It's completely different. Slow, meditative, honest work. I can see exactly what I've accomplished at the end of each day. I tried to picture Daniel as a banker, suit and tie, rushing through crowded streets, making deals that moved abstract millions from one account to another. Then I tried to picture him as a woodworker, hands covered in sawdust, carefully shaping something beautiful and functional from raw materials. The second image felt more real somehow, more aligned with the gentle voice floating down from above. That's a big change, I said. Biggest change I ever made. And the best. Daniel paused. What about you? Have you always been a librarian? Pretty much. I got my MLIS right out of college and never looked back. I know it's not very adventurous, but I like the predictability of it. Books don't surprise you the way people do. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I considered the question, watching the elevator buttons blur slightly as I stared at them. I used to think it was good. Lately, I'm not so sure. What changed? There it was again. That gentle probing, the sense that Daniel was actually listening to my answers instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. When was the last time someone had asked me what changed about anything? I turned 30 last month, I said, though that wasn't really the whole truth. I looked around at my life and realized that everything in it was exactly the same as it had been 5 years ago. Same job, same apartment, same routines, same loneliness. The last word slipped out before I could stop it, hanging in the air between us like a confession I hadn't meant to make. Ah, Daniel said softly. I know that feeling. Do you? Oh, yes. I spent my 30s married to a woman I cared about but wasn't in love with, working a job that paid well but felt meaningless, living in a house that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty inside. I was surrounded by people and more lonely than I'd ever been in my life. The honesty in his admission made my chest tighten. Here was someone who had felt the same suffocating isolation I lived with every day, the same sense of being surrounded by life but not actually participating in it. What happened to your marriage? I asked, then immediately regretted the question. Sorry, that's too personal. It's okay. It ended about 3 years ago. Mutual decision, mostly. We both finally admitted that we were better as friends than as spouses. Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the old pain underneath. She wanted children, a real family. I wanted something else, something I couldn't name at the time. And now? Can you name it now? Daniel was quiet for so long that I wondered if he was going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Now, I think what I wanted was to stop pretending. To find someone who saw me, really saw me, and didn't need me to be anyone other than who I actually am. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were exactly what I had been feeling without being able to articulate it. All those years of careful politeness with coworkers, surface-level conversations with acquaintances, nights spent alone in my apartment wondering why connection felt so impossible. Maybe it wasn't because I was fundamentally flawed. Maybe it was because I had never learned how to stop pretending long enough to let someone see who I actually was. That sounds terrifying, I said. It is, but less terrifying than spending the rest of my life hiding. I heard movement above me, the sound of Daniel shifting position on what I assumed was the floor of the third-floor landing. I found myself wondering what he looked like right now. Was he sitting cross-legged, leaning against the elevator doors, staring up at the ceiling? The invisible nature of our conversation made it feel both more intimate and safer, like talking to a stranger on a long-distance phone call. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Sure. Are you happy, Alex from 5B? In general, I mean. The question was simple and devastating. No one had asked me that in years, and the answer came to me immediately and unwanted. No, I said quietly. I don't think I am. What would happiness look like? If you could design it. I closed my eyes, even though I was already surrounded by the semi-darkness of the stalled elevator. What would happiness look like? I tried to imagine it and found that I couldn't picture anything specific, just a vague sense of warmth, of belonging somewhere, of being seen and accepted by someone who mattered. I don't know, I admitted. I think I've been unhappy for so long that I've forgotten what the alternative looks like. I used to feel that way too. Like happiness was something other people experienced, but not something available to me. Daniel's voice was gentle, understanding. I think that's what loneliness does. It convinces you that connection is impossible, that you're somehow fundamentally different from everyone else. Are you? Different, I mean. In some ways, yes. But not in the ways that matter for connection. There was something loaded in the way he said it, some deeper meaning I couldn't quite grasp. But before I could ask him to elaborate, I heard the mechanical hum of machinery starting up somewhere above us. The elevator shuddered, then began to rise slowly toward the third floor. Looks like they got it working, Daniel said. Are you ready to see daylight again? I think so. The elevator doors opened onto the third-floor landing, and I got my first clear look at Daniel in years. He was sitting on the floor next to the elevator, back against the wall, exactly as I had imagined. But seeing him up close, I was struck by details I had never noticed during our brief hallway encounters. He was more handsome than I remembered, not in a polished, conventional way, but in the way of someone who had lived fully and honestly. His hair was more gray than brown now, and there were lines around his eyes that suggested he laughed often. He was wearing a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, both of which looked worn and comfortable. His hands, resting on his knees, were strong and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with wood and tools and created things that lasted. But what struck me most was the way he was looking at me, not with the polite disinterest I was used to from neighbors, but with genuine warmth and what looked like curiosity. Like he was actually glad to see me, glad to finally put a face to the voice he'd been talking to for the past hour. "Alex," he said, getting to his feet with an easy grace. "It's good to finally meet you properly." "You too." I stepped out of the elevator, my grocery bags in hand, suddenly self-conscious about my appearance. I had been running errands in my weekend clothes, old jeans and a sweater with a small hole near the left elbow. Next to Daniel's understated but well-put-together appearance, I felt rumpled and unprepared. "Are your groceries okay?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the bags. "Probably not. The frozen stuff is definitely not frozen anymore." I looked down at the bags, which had been my excuse for hurrying home and hiding in my apartment for the rest of the weekend. Now the thought of going upstairs and spending another evening alone felt less appealing than it had an hour ago. That's a shame. Nothing worse than soggy, frozen vegetables. I laughed, surprised by how easy it felt. Actually, I think there are quite a few things worse than soggy, frozen vegetables. True. But in the category of minor domestic disappointments, it's definitely top 10. We stood there for a moment in the hallway, neither of us making a move toward our respective doors. The conversation felt unfinished somehow, like there were things we had been in the middle of discussing that couldn't be easily abandoned just because the elevator was working again. "Thank you," I said finally, "for talking me through that. It was nice. Having company, I mean, even invisible company." Daniel's smile was warm and genuine. It was nice for me, too. I spend a lot of time alone these days, and most of my conversations are with wood grain and sandpaper. They're not great conversationalists. I bet they're good listeners, though. Excellent listeners. Never interrupt, never judge, but they don't laugh at my jokes either. "Do you tell a lot of jokes to your furniture projects?" "More than I probably should, but working alone for hours at a time, you start talking to yourself, or to whatever you're working on. It's either that or go completely crazy." I thought about my own solitary days at the library, the way I sometimes caught myself having entire conversations in my head with patrons who never asked the questions I imagined they might ask. The difference was that Daniel seemed comfortable with his solitude in a way I never had been with mine. "Well," I said, lifting my grocery bags slightly, "I should probably get these upstairs before they get any warmer." Of course. But Daniel didn't move toward his door either. He seemed to be wrestling with something, some decision he wasn't sure how to make. "Alex," he said finally, "I know this might sound strange, but would you like to have dinner sometime? Real dinner, not frozen vegetables and whatever else you've got in those bags." The invitation caught me completely off guard. In 4 years of living in this building, no neighbor had ever invited me to anything. I wasn't even sure it was something neighbors did anymore. I started, then stopped, not sure how to respond. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was how complications started, that getting involved with a neighbor was asking for trouble, that I barely knew this man despite our hour-long elevator conversation. But there was something about the way Daniel was looking at me, hopeful but not presumptuous, interested but not pushy, that made rationality seem less important than possibility. "I'd like that," I heard myself saying. Daniel's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Really? Good. That's good. Are you free tomorrow night? I could cook, if you don't mind coming down to my place. Fair warning, I'm a better woodworker than I am a chef, but I make a decent pasta. Tomorrow night sounds perfect. And I'm sure your cooking is better than my usual frozen dinners. That's not exactly a high bar to clear, but I'll do my best." Daniel's smile was infectious. "Should we say 7 o'clock? 7 sounds great." We stood there for another moment, both of us seeming reluctant to end the interaction. There was something charged in the air between us, some current of possibility that I wasn't quite ready to examine, but didn't want to let go of either. "I should let you get those groceries put away," Daniel said finally. "Right. Yes." I shifted the bags in my hands, suddenly aware that I had been standing there like an idiot, making no move toward the stairwell. "Thank you again. for the rescue and the dinner invitation. Thank you for getting stuck in the elevator. It was the most interesting conversation I've had in months. I headed toward the stairs, then turned back when I reached the door to the stairwell. Daniel was still standing by the elevator, watching me go with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Daniel?" I said. "Yeah? I'm glad the elevator broke down." His smile was radiant. "Me too." I climbed the 2 flights to my apartment, my groceries feeling lighter somehow despite the fact that they had been sitting in a warm elevator for over an hour. When I reached my door, I could hear the faint sound of movement from Daniel's apartment below. Footsteps, the soft thud of a door closing, the general sounds of someone going about their evening routine. For the first time in months, I wasn't the only person in the building I was aware of. For the first time in longer than that, I had plans with another human being that extended beyond work-related obligations or casual pleasantries with service workers. I put away my groceries. The frozen vegetables were indeed soggy, the milk was warm, the wine was fine, and found myself looking around my apartment with new eyes. When was the last time someone else had been here? When was the last time I had cared what my living space looked like to another person? The apartment was clean but impersonal, furnished with items chosen more for functionality than style. There were books everywhere, occupational hazard of being a librarian, but no real decoration, no pictures on the walls, nothing that suggested a personality or interests beyond the purely professional. It was the apartment of someone who spent as little time at home as possible, someone who treated their living space like a way station rather than a home. But suddenly, seeing it through imaginary eyes, Daniel's eyes, perhaps, it felt less like minimalism and more like emptiness. I opened the bottle of wine I had bought and poured myself a glass, then sat on my couch and tried to process what had happened. In the span of an hour, my routine Saturday afternoon had been completely derailed by a broken elevator and a conversation with a neighbor I barely knew. And somehow, that derailment had led to my first social plan in months. What struck me most was how easy it had been to talk to Daniel. Usually, conversations with new people felt like work, a careful navigation of safe topics and polite responses, designed to get through the interaction without revealing too much or saying the wrong thing. But talking to Daniel had felt natural, like sliding into a warm bath after being cold for a long time. Maybe it was the unusual circumstance of our conversation, the way being trapped in the elevator had stripped away the normal social expectations. Or maybe it was something specific about Daniel himself, the warmth in his voice, the way he asked questions like he actually wanted to hear the answers, the casual honesty with which he had shared details about his own life. I found myself thinking about what he had said about his marriage, about wanting to stop pretending and find someone who saw him for who he actually was. There had been something in the way he said it that felt significant, like he was talking about more than just general authenticity. And then there was the way he had looked at me when the elevator doors opened, not just friendly, but interested in a way that made something flutter in my chest. It had been so long since someone had looked at me with genuine curiosity that I had almost forgotten what it felt like. I finished my wine and found myself looking forward to tomorrow evening with an anticipation that surprised me. When was the last time I had looked forward to anything social? When was the last time the prospect of spending time with another person had felt like a gift rather than an obligation? The next day passed slowly. I spent the morning cleaning my apartment more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in months. Not because Daniel was likely to see it, but because the act of caring about my living space felt symbolically important. I went to the gym, read a book, did laundry, all normal Sunday activities that somehow felt different because they were leading up to something. At 6:30, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror trying to decide what to wear to dinner with a neighbor I had only officially met the day before. I settled on dark jeans and a button-down shirt that was casual but suggested I had made an effort. Then I changed into a sweater, then back to the shirt. Then I forced myself to stop overthinking it and headed downstairs. Daniel's apartment was a mirror image of mine in terms of layout, but that's where the similarities ended. Where my place was sparse and impersonal, his was warm and lived in, filled with evidence of a life fully inhabited. The most striking feature was his workspace. One corner of the living room had been converted into a mini wood shop, complete with a workbench, hand tools, and several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion. The air carried the faint scent of wood shavings and varnish, not unpleasant, but completely different from the generic apartment smell of my own place. "This is amazing," I said, looking around. "It's like a real home." Daniel paused in his movement toward the kitchen, a slight frown crossing his face. "As opposed to what?" "As opposed to my place, which looks like a hotel room where someone has been staying too long." I ran my hand along the surface of his workbench, feeling the smooth wood grain. "Everything here feels intentional, chosen, like you actually thought about how you wanted to live instead of just buying whatever was functional." "It took me a long time to figure out how I wanted to live." "Most of my adult life, actually." Daniel's expression softened. "After my divorce, I realized I had never made any decisions about my environment that weren't based on what other people expected or what seemed appropriate for someone in my position. This place is the first space that's ever felt like me. I could understand that completely. My apartment wasn't really decorated so much as furnished by necessity, filled with items that served purposes but didn't reflect preferences or personality. Looking around Daniel's space, I could see him in every choice. The warm wood tones, the comfortable furniture, the books and tools arranged not for display but for use. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward a half-finished piece on his workbench. "Bookshelf. Custom commission for a client who has a very specific space and very particular ideas about joinery." Daniel moved closer, running his hand over the wood with obvious affection. "It's challenging work, but that's what makes it interesting." "Can I touch it?" "Of course." I ran my fingers over the smooth wood, impressed by the precision of the joints, the way different pieces fit together seamlessly. "It's beautiful. You can see the craftsmanship in every detail." "Thank you." It's satisfying work. Slow and meditative, but you can see exactly what you've accomplished at the end of each day. Daniel watched me examine his work, and there was something almost vulnerable in his expression, like he was showing me something important about himself. "It's completely different from banking, I imagine." "Night and day. Banking was all about abstractions, moving numbers around, creating value that only existed on paper. This is real, tangible. When I finish a piece, it exists in the world, and it'll probably outlast me." The passion in his voice when he talked about his work was infectious. I found myself thinking about my own job, about the satisfaction I got from helping people find information, but also about the limitations of working with other people's knowledge instead of creating something myself. "Do you miss it at all? The banking?" "I miss the money sometimes," Daniel said with a rueful laugh, "but not much else. I was good at it, but I was never happy doing it. There's something to be said for work that feels meaningful, even if it doesn't pay as well." "How did you know? That you wanted to leave, I mean." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the piece of wood. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "I think I knew for years before I admitted it to myself. I would sit in meetings talking about market projections and profit margins, and I felt like I was watching someone else's life, like I was playing a role in a play I didn't remember auditioning for." He looked up at me, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "After my divorce, I realized I had been living that way in every area of my life. Work, marriage, everything. Just going through the motions of being the person I thought I was supposed to be." "What changed?" "I met someone who showed me what it looked like to actually live authentically instead of just performing a version of yourself for other people." Daniel's voice grew softer. "It wasn't romantic. Just a friend who was so completely himself that it made me realize how much energy I was spending on being who I thought other people wanted me to be. There was something in the way he said it, some careful emphasis that made me think there was more to the story than he was telling. But before I could ask, the timer on his stove went off. "Dinner," Daniel said, moving toward the kitchen. "I hope you like pasta with whatever I could find in my refrigerator." "I'm sure it's better than my usual Sunday night meal." "Which is?" "Cereal. Sometimes toast if I'm feeling ambitious." Daniel looked genuinely horrified. "Alex, that's not dinner, that's barely a snack. It's efficient." "It's depressing." Daniel pulled a bottle of wine from the counter and held it up. "This should help make up for my questionable cooking skills." Dinner was actually excellent, simple but well prepared, the kind of meal that suggested Daniel took care of himself in ways I had never learned to do. We ate at his small dining table, which was set with actual cloth napkins and mismatched plates that somehow looked intentional rather than accidental. "So," Daniel said, refilling our wine glasses, "tell me about being a librarian. What's the strangest research question you've ever gotten?" "Last month, someone wanted to know whether it was possible to train pigeons to deliver love letters in a major metropolitan area. Turned out they were writing a novel, but they wanted to make sure the premise was at least theoretically feasible." "And is it?" "Surprisingly, yes. Pigeons have been used for message delivery for centuries, and they're actually quite reliable over distances up to about 50 miles. The main challenges in a city would be predators and navigating around tall buildings." Daniel laughed, a genuine sound that made something warm spread through my chest. "I love that you actually researched that. Most people would have just said no and moved on. That's the difference between a good librarian and a great one. We don't just find information. We find the right information, even when the question seems impossible." "What made you want to be a librarian?" It was a question people asked often, usually with barely concealed condescension, as if librarianship was something people fell into rather than chose. But Daniel asked it like he was genuinely curious, like he thought there might be an interesting story behind the career choice. "I've always loved books, obviously. But more than that, I love the idea of being helpful in a way that matters. People come to the library when they're looking for something specific, and often they don't even know exactly what that is. Being able to help them find it, whether it's information for a research project or just the perfect book to read on a rainy afternoon, feels like a small but meaningful way to make people's lives better." "That's beautiful," Daniel said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I never thought about librarianship that way, but you're right. You're like a translator between people and information." "I like that description. A translator." I took a sip of wine, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. "What about you? How did you know you wanted to work with wood?" "I didn't at first. When I left banking, I had no idea what I wanted to do instead. I just knew I needed to work with my hands, create something tangible." Daniel's face lit up as he talked about his work. "I took a woodworking class at a community college thinking it would be a hobby. But the first time I made something, just a simple cutting board, and saw how the grain came alive under the finish, I was hooked." "What do you love most about it?" "The honesty of it. Wood doesn't lie to you. If your measurements are off, if your joints aren't precise, if you rush through a step, the piece will tell you. You can't fake good craftsmanship." Daniel paused, his eyes distant. After 20 years of work that was all about presentation and perception, it was a relief to do something that was just about being good at what it actually was. I could hear the deeper meaning in what he was saying, the way his choice of career had been connected to larger questions about authenticity and truth. There was something almost philosophical about the way he talked about his work, like it represented more than just a job change. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving banking?" "Never, not once." Daniel's answer was immediate and firm. "I make a fraction of what I used to make. I live in a smaller space. I drive an older car. And I'm happier than I've ever been in my adult life." "What changed?" Besides the work, I mean. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. When he looked up at me, there was something vulnerable in his expression, something that looked like a decision being made. I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't, he said quietly. I stopped trying to fit into a life that looked right from the outside but felt wrong on the inside. What did that look like? The pretending. Everything. The career I chose because it seemed impressive. The woman I married because she was appropriate and kind and everyone said we made a good couple. The house in the suburbs with the right kind of furniture and the right kind of car in the driveway. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper now. I spent 20 years building a life that looked exactly like what I thought success was supposed to look like, and I was miserable every single day. And now? Now I live alone in a small apartment. I make furniture for people who appreciate craftsmanship. I have exactly 3 close friends and a relationship with my ex-wife that's better than our marriage ever was. Daniel's smile was soft and genuine. I'm single, I'm middle-aged, I work with my hands, and I've never been happier. There was something in the way he emphasized single that felt significant, like he was telling me something important about his current availability. Combined with everything else he had said about authenticity and pretending, I was beginning to form a picture of someone who had made fundamental changes, not just in career, but in how he understood himself. That sounds like a good life, I said. It is. It's my life, finally, instead of some version I thought I was supposed to want. Daniel looked directly at me, his eyes holding mine. What about you, Alex? Are you living your life or the life you think you're supposed to want? The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was so precisely accurate. I thought about my neat, impersonal apartment, my routine job, my careful avoidance of anything that might complicate or challenge the small, controlled existence I had built for myself. I don't know, I admitted. I think I've been so focused on not making mistakes that I forgot to make choices. What would choosing look like? I have no idea. That's the problem. I took a larger sip of wine than I had intended. I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my own life for so long that I don't even know what I actually want anymore. What wakes you up? What makes you feel most like yourself? I thought about it, trying to identify moments when I felt truly engaged with my own existence, rather than just going through the motions. Books, I said finally. Not just reading them, but the moment when I help someone find exactly the right information or the perfect story for what they need. There's something magical about that connection, between person and book, between question and answer. That sounds like choosing to me. You chose work that lets you create those connections. Maybe. But everything else in my life feels like default settings, like I just took whatever was easiest or safest instead of thinking about what I actually wanted. Daniel nodded slowly, recognition in his eyes. I know that feeling. The safety of never having to risk disappointment because you never really try for anything. Exactly. I was surprised by how relieved I felt to have someone understand what I meant. But lately, safe feels more like stuck. What would unstuck look like? I opened my mouth to answer, then realized I didn't know. What would unstuck look like? What would it mean to actually engage with my own life instead of just managing it? I don't know, I said again. But I think it would start with admitting that I'm lonely, and that the loneliness isn't just circumstantial. It's because I've been too afraid to let anyone see who I actually am. The admission hung between us. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story, Part 2. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. The words hung in the narrow hallway like morning mist, delicate and ephemeral, yet somehow heavy with possibility. Marcus stood framed in his doorway, the warm light from his apartment spilling around him into the dim corridor. His hand rested against the doorframe, fingers curled as if anchoring himself to something solid, while his world tilted on its axis. I stood frozen with one foot already crossed into the hallway, my body caught between two gravitational pulls. Behind me lay everything familiar. My apartment 20 feet away, my routine, my carefully constructed understanding of who I was and what I wanted. Ahead stretched the unknown, embodied by this man whose quiet loneliness had somehow awakened something in me I didn't even know existed. The silence stretched between us. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with questions neither of us dared voice. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the building with increasing urgency. Each drop seemed to echo the uncertainty pulsing through my veins, the storm reflecting the chaos in my chest. The word escaped before I could catch it, then died in my throat like a bird with clipped wings. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been thinking about him constantly since our first conversation 3 weeks ago? That his stories of distant places and faded photographs had kept me awake, staring at my ceiling and wondering what it would feel like to matter to someone the way those memories clearly mattered to him? Marcus must have sensed my internal struggle because he took a small step back, creating space for me to breathe, to choose. The gesture was so careful, so considerate, that it made my chest ache. When was the last time someone had given me room to want something without pressure or expectation? "The storm's getting worse," he said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. He was offering me an excuse, a way to stay without having to examine too closely why I wanted to. We both knew I had an umbrella in my apartment. We both knew a little rain wouldn't hurt me. But sometimes we need permission to do what we're already desperate to do. I looked down the hallway toward my own door. It seemed impossibly far away now, though it was less than 20 steps. My apartment waited for me there, silent, orderly, predictable. The same books on the nightstand, the same dishes in the sink, the same life that had felt perfectly adequate until Marcus had first invited me in and shown me what real conversation could feel like. The rain grew louder, as if the building itself was urging me to make a choice. I turned back to Marcus, studying his face in the hallway's amber light. There was hope there, carefully guarded but unmistakable, flickering like a candle flame that had weathered too many storms to burn boldly, but refused to be extinguished entirely. "Maybe I should wait it out," I said, my voice coming out rougher than intended. The words felt monumental, like signing my name to a contract I hadn't fully read. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, relief so swift and complete it took my breath away. Had he really expected me to leave? Had he been preparing himself for another evening alone? Another night of moving through his apartment like a ghost haunting his own existence? "Of course," he said, stepping aside with a gesture that was both welcoming and uncertain. "Please come in." I crossed back over the threshold, and the simple act felt like stepping across a bridge I might never be able to cross back over. The door closed behind me with a soft click that seemed to seal us into this moment, this choice, this terrifying possibility. His apartment felt different now, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Every detail seemed more vivid, more significant. The way the lamplight caught the edges of his bookshelves, the faint scent of coffee and something warmer, his cologne maybe, or just the indefinable smell of a life lived in solitude. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of our breathing, the creak of floorboards under our feet, the way shadows danced on the walls like they were performing just for us. "Can I offer you something?" Marcus asked, his hands hovering at his sides as if he'd forgotten what to do with them. "I have coffee, tea, or I think there's a bottle of wine I've been saving for." He trailed off, perhaps realizing he'd been about to say, "for a special occasion," and wasn't sure if this qualified. "Wine sounds perfect," I said, grateful for something to occupy our hands and mouths while we figured out what came next. He nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the storm and my racing thoughts. I found myself drawn to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass and watching the water stream down in rivulets that caught and scattered the streetlight below. The city beyond was transformed, the familiar made mysterious by the veil of rain. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since Marcus was just a polite nod in the hallway, a neighbor I recognized but didn't know. Now, standing in his living room while he opened wine in the next room, I felt like I was balanced on the edge of something vast and unknowable. How does a person's world tilt so completely in such a short time? "I wasn't sure what you'd prefer," Marcus said, returning with 2 glasses of deep red wine. "This is a Bordeaux I picked up in France a few years ago. I've been waiting for the right moment to open it." Our fingers brushed as he handed me the glass, and the contact sent electricity shooting up my arm. If Marcus felt it too, he didn't show it overtly, but I caught the way his breath hitched, the way his gaze lingered on my face a heartbeat too long. "Thank you," I murmured, taking a careful sip. The wine was exceptional, rich and complex, with layers of flavor that unfolded slowly on my tongue. It tasted expensive, important, the kind of wine you save for moments that matter. We settled onto his couch, not quite side by side, but closer than casual acquaintances should sit. The space between us hummed with tension, like the air before lightning strikes. Marcus cradled his wine glass with both hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things we couldn't yet say, weighted with possibility and fear in equal measure. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the windows, each gust of wind making the glass rattle in its frame. "I don't do this often," Marcus said finally, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to catch it over the rain. "Do what?" "Have people over. Share wine. Talk." He glanced at me sideways, vulnerability written across his features like a language I was only beginning to learn to read. Exist in the same space as another human being for more than 5 minutes. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was surprising, I'd sensed his isolation from our first conversation, but because of how he said it, like he was confessing to some fundamental failing rather than simply describing the circumstances of his life. "How long has it been like that?" I asked gently. Marcus took a long sip of his wine, buying time to consider his answer. "A while," he said eventually. "Long enough that I've forgotten how to be anything other than alone." There was such resignation in his voice, such quiet acceptance of a fate he'd never chosen, but had learned to endure. I wanted to ask how it had happened, what series of events had led to such profound isolation. But something told me those were stories for another conversation, another level of trust we hadn't yet reached. Instead, I found myself sharing something I'd never told anyone. "I had a professor in college," I said, the memory surfacing unbidden. "Dr. Williams. He taught literature, and he was brilliant, could make Shakespeare feel as immediate as yesterday's newspaper. But there was something about him, something that made you realize he was carrying a deep sadness." Marcus's attention focused entirely on me, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "One day after class, I stayed behind to ask about an assignment, and I found him just sitting there in the empty classroom, staring at nothing. When he noticed me, he said something I've never forgotten." I paused, feeling the weight of the memory. "The worst kind of loneliness isn't being alone," he said. "It's being surrounded by people who see you every day but don't really see you at all." Marcus set his wine glass down with careful precision, his hands not entirely steady. "What happened to him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I graduated, moved away. But I think about him sometimes. Wonder if anyone ever really saw him. If he ever found someone who understood that behind all that knowledge and eloquence was just a person who wanted to matter to someone." The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I hadn't meant to be so transparent about why I'd shared the story, but looking at Marcus's face, I could see he understood. He saw the parallel, recognized himself in the description of a man who'd learned to hide his loneliness behind competence and self-sufficiency. "Is that what you think when you look at me?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I'm someone who wants to matter?" The question was loaded with such vulnerability that it made my throat tight. I could have deflected, could have given some safe, non-committal answer. Instead, I chose honesty. "I think you're someone who matters whether you know it or not," I said. "But I also think you've been alone so long you've forgotten what it feels like to be seen." Marcus's eyes glistened in the lamplight, and for a moment I thought he might cry. Instead, he reached for his wine glass again, taking a sip that seemed more like steadying himself than enjoying the drink. "You're not wrong," he said finally. "Some days I feel like I'm disappearing, becoming transparent. Like if I stood still long enough, people would walk right through me." The image was so heartbreaking that I found myself leaning forward, closing some of the distance between us without conscious thought. "You're not disappearing," I said firmly. "You're right here. You're real and solid and—" I struggled for the right word. "Present. You're the most present person I've talked to in years." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, surprise giving way to something warmer, more hopeful. "You really mean that?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I do." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was urging us toward some kind of revelation. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the windows into abstract paintings of light and shadow. But inside, the world had narrowed to just this. The space between us on the couch, the wine making everything feel slightly unreal, the way Marcus was looking at me like I'd just handed him something precious. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, setting his glass aside entirely now. I nodded. I used to travel a lot when I was younger. Partly for work, partly just because I could. And in every city, every country, I'd find myself in cafes or bars or hotel lobbies, watching couples, families, groups of friends. He paused, his fingers worrying at the fabric of the couch. I'd make up stories about them, imagine what their lives were like when they went home together, and I'd wonder what it would feel like to be going home with someone, to have conversations that continued from one day to the next, instead of starting and ending with strangers. The longing in his voice was palpable, years of accumulated solitude concentrated into words. I wanted to reach out, to touch his hand or his arm, some gesture of comfort. But I wasn't sure if that would be welcome. Wasn't sure what the boundaries were in this strange new territory we were navigating. "Is that why you stopped traveling?" I asked. "Partly." Marcus shifted on the couch, angling himself more toward me. It became too hard, being a tourist in other people's happiness. Easier to stay home, to control the environment, to not be confronted with reminders of what I was missing. The confession hung between us like a bridge, an invitation to cross over into deeper intimacy, to share the weight of understood loneliness. I thought about my own life, my own carefully controlled environment designed to minimize the ache of wanting more than I had. "I do something similar," I admitted. "Not with traveling, but I've gotten very good at avoiding situations where I might feel like an outsider. Dinner parties, weddings, holidays with friends' families. I tell myself I prefer quiet evenings, that I'm just more introverted than most people. But sometimes I catch myself staring at groups of people laughing together, and I realize I'm holding my breath, like I'm underwater and they're all breathing air I can't reach." The metaphor seemed to resonate with Marcus because he nodded slowly, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Exactly," he said. "Like watching life happen through glass." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing the weight of shared understanding. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, wind rattling the windows and rain drumming against the building with almost violent intensity. But inside, something was settling between us, a recognition of kindred loneliness that made the space feel safer, more intimate. I'm glad you stayed, Marcus said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he'd been holding them back and could no longer contain them. So am I replied, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Marcus's hand was resting on the couch between us, and almost without thinking, I let my own hand drift closer until our fingers were nearly touching. The space between them seemed to crackle with possibility, a gap of maybe 2 inches that felt like a chasm I wasn't sure I had the courage to cross. But Marcus, it seemed, was braver than I was. His pinky finger extended slightly, brushing against mine in the lightest possible contact. It was barely a touch, just skin grazing skin for the briefest moment, but it sent electricity shooting up my entire arm. I looked up to find him watching me carefully, searching my face for any sign that the contact was unwelcome. When I didn't pull away, when I actually shifted my hand closer to his expression softened into something like wonder. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Instead of answering with words, I let my hand slide the rest of the way, covering his completely. His skin was warm and slightly rough, real and solid and perfect under my palm. I felt him exhale, a breath he seemed to have been holding since the moment we sat down. "It's more than okay," I said, meaning it completely. We stayed like that for several heartbeats, hands overlapped, both of us staring down at the connection like it was something miraculous. And maybe it was. When had I last held someone's hand? When had such a simple touch felt so momentous? "I should tell you," Marcus said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of my hand. "I haven't felt this way about someone in longer than I care to admit." The admission made my heart skip beats. What way? He looked up from our joined hands to meet my eyes, and I saw something raw and vulnerable there, something that made my breath catch in my chest. "Like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought," he said. "Like maybe there's still a part of me capable of wanting more than just getting through another day." The honesty in his voice, the careful hope in his words, broke something open in my chest. How long had he been just surviving instead of living? How many nights had he gone to bed wondering if this was all there was? "You're not broken," I said fiercely, my free hand coming up to rest on his arm. "Lonely, maybe. Isolated. But not broken. Never broken." Marcus's eyes filled with tears he didn't let fall, and his grip on my hand tightened as if I were an anchor in rough seas. "Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." "The difference is that broken things can't love," I said, the words coming from some deeper part of myself I rarely accessed. "And you have so much love in you it practically radiates from your skin. You're just scared to let it out." A single tear escaped then, sliding down Marcus's cheek before he could stop it. I reached up without thinking, brushing it away with my thumb, and suddenly we were closer than we'd been before, my hand cupping his cheek while he leaned into the touch like he was starving for it. "You don't know me well enough to say that," he whispered. But there was no conviction in it, just hope struggling against years of self-doubt. "Maybe not," I agreed, my thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. "But I know that you remember the names of the characters in books you read 20 years ago. I know you keep that stray cat fed even though it won't let you pet it. I know you listen to me talk about my day like it's the most interesting thing you've ever heard, and you ask questions that show you actually care about the answers." Marcus's eyes drifted closed, and he pressed his face more firmly into my palm. "Those are small things." "Love is made of small things," I said. "It's not grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It's remembering how someone takes their coffee and asking about their day and making them feel like they matter." The word love hung between us, heavy with implication. I hadn't meant to say it, hadn't been thinking about the weight of the word. But now that it was out there, I realized I didn't want to take it back. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? This tender concern for his well-being, this desire to see him happy, this fierce protectiveness that made me want to shield him from every hurt he'd endured. It was love in its earliest, most fragile form. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at me with such intensity that I felt exposed, like he could see straight through to my soul. "Are you saying you love me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question should have terrified me. 3 weeks ago, I would have laughed at the idea of falling for my older male neighbor, would have dismissed it as impossible, ridiculous, completely outside the realm of my experience or desire. But looking at Marcus now, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, feeling the warmth of his skin under my palm, I realized that love didn't always ask permission before taking root. "I'm saying I could," I answered honestly. "I'm saying that if you let me, if you want me to, I think I could love you very easily." Marcus made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and before I could process what was happening, he was leaning forward, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stayed like that for a moment, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, both of us trembling with the magnitude of what we'd just acknowledged. "I want that," Marcus whispered against my lips, so close now that I could feel the words as much as hear them. "I want that so much it scares me." "Why does it scare you?" "Because I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be with someone, how to share space, how to be vulnerable without being a burden. I've been alone so long I've forgotten how to be half of something instead of just one." His honesty was devastating and beautiful in equal measure. I understood what he was saying because I felt it too, the fear of disrupting carefully constructed solitude, the terror of depending on someone who might leave, the vulnerability of letting someone see all your rough edges and broken places. "I don't know how to do this either," I confessed. "I've never felt this way about anyone, let alone—" I gestured vaguely between us. "A man?" he supplied gently. I nodded. "That too. But more than that, I've never felt this urgency, this sense that if I don't follow this feeling wherever it leads, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Marcus pulled back slightly so he could look at me properly, his hand coming up to mirror mine on his cheek, his palm warm against my skin. "Then maybe we figure it out together," he said. "Maybe we stop trying to have all the answers and just see what happens." The simplicity of the suggestion was both terrifying and liberating. All my life, I'd been a planner, someone who liked to know where I was going and how I was going to get there. But maybe some journeys were meant to be taken without a map. Maybe some discoveries could only be made by walking into the unknown with someone brave enough to walk beside you. "Okay," I said, the word coming out on an exhale. "Let's see what happens." Marcus's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Really? Really?" And then, because words felt insufficient for everything I was feeling, because the space between us had become unbearable, because I'd never wanted anything as much as I wanted to kiss this man, I leaned forward and pressed my lips gently to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. Marcus went very still for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe it was happening, and then he was kissing me back with a tenderness that made my chest ache. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like wine and something uniquely him that I wanted to memorize. It was nothing like kissing a woman. His stubble was rough against my chin, his mouth broader, his body solid and masculine in a way that should have felt foreign but instead felt like coming home. Every nerve ending was on fire, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. I could taste the wine on his tongue, smell his cologne mixed with something earthier and more primal, feel the slight tremor in his hands where they cupped my face. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, our foreheads still pressed together. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy, and Marcus's hands were still framing my face like I was something precious he was afraid to let go of. "That was—" I started, then trailed off, unable to find words adequate for what I was feeling. "My first kiss with someone who mattered in over 5 years," Marcus finished, his voice rough with emotion. The admission made my chest tight with tenderness and something fiercer, more protective. "Mine too," I said. "In a different way, but mine too." Marcus's thumb traced my bottom lip with reverent gentleness. "Was it what you expected?" "Better," I said honestly. "So much better. I didn't know it could feel like that." "Like what?" I searched for the right words, trying to articulate something I'd never experienced before. "Like coming alive," I said finally. "Like waking up from a dream I didn't even know I was having." Marcus's smile was soft and wondering and tinged with something like awe. "I know exactly what you mean." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease slightly, the driving rain settling into a steadier rhythm against the windows, but I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on Marcus, on the way the lamplight played across his features, on the incredible fact that this man, this kind, lonely, beautiful man, wanted me as much as I wanted him. "What do we do now?" I asked, voicing the question that had been hovering at the edge of my consciousness. "I don't know," Marcus admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "It's been so long since I've been in this situation, I've forgotten what comes next." The vulnerability in his admission made me want to protect him, to make this as easy and comfortable as possible. "We don't have to do anything," I said. "We can just exist in this moment. See how it feels." Marcus's relief was palpable. "I'd like that." He shifted on the couch, creating a space beside him and opening his arms in invitation. I didn't hesitate, settling against his side with my head on his shoulder and my hand resting on his chest. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close, and I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't even realized was tight. This was what I'd been missing all these years. Not just physical closeness, but emotional intimacy. The feeling of being held not just with arms, but with care, with attention, with the kind of tenderness that made you feel precious. "This is nice," I murmured against his shoulder, breathing in his scent and letting myself melt into his warmth. "It's perfect," Marcus replied, his cheek resting against the top of my head. "I could stay like this forever." We lay like that for a long time, listening to the rain and to each other's breathing. Marcus's hand traced lazy patterns on my back, and I found myself growing drowsy despite the emotional intensity of the evening. There was something deeply soothing about being held like this, about the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, about the way he pressed occasional kisses to my hair like he couldn't help himself. "Tell me something," I said drowsily, my eyes drifting closed. "What kind of something?" "Anything. Something I don't know about you." Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I used to have a dog," he said finally. "A golden retriever named Charlie. He was the best companion I ever had. Never judged me for spending entire weekends reading. Never made me feel guilty for preferring quiet evenings to parties." "What happened to him?" "Old age, eventually. But before that." Marcus paused, his hand stilling on my back. "I had to give him up when I moved to this building. The lease didn't allow pets, and I couldn't find anywhere else I could afford that would take both of us." The pain in his voice was evident, even years later. I lifted my head to look at him, seeing the regret written across his features. "I still think about him," Marcus continued. "Wonder if he's happy with his new family, if he misses me the way I miss him." "I'm sure he does," I said softly. "Animals don't forget the people who love them." Marcus's smile was sad but genuine. "I hope so." I settled back against his chest, processing this new piece of his story. Another loss, another sacrifice made in service of survival rather than living. How many pieces of himself had he given up over the years? "Maybe someday you can get another dog," I suggested. "Maybe," Marcus agreed, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. It's hard to commit to caring for something when you're not sure you'll be able to follow through. The comment revealed so much about his mindset, his fear of his own impermanence, his reluctance to make promises he might not be able to keep. I wanted to tell him that he was stronger than he thought, more capable of commitment than he realized. But that felt like too much, too soon. Instead, I just held him tighter, trying to convey through touch what I couldn't yet say with words. The storm outside was definitely weakening now, the wind dying down, and the rain becoming more intermittent. But neither of us moved to acknowledge the change. We were cocooned here together, sheltered from the world and its demands, and I found myself hoping the rain would never stop entirely. I should probably go soon, I said eventually, though I made no move to leave his embrace. Should you? Marcus asked, his arms tightening around me slightly. The storm might pick up again. I smiled at the transparent excuse. It might. And it's late. You might slip on the wet floors in the hallway. Very dangerous, I agreed solemnly. Plus, I make excellent coffee in the morning. It would be a shame for you to miss that. The casual mention of morning made my heart skip beats. He was asking me to stay the night, not in so many words, but clearly enough that there was no mistaking his meaning. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Are you asking me to stay? I said, lifting my head to meet his eyes. Marcus looked nervous suddenly, uncertain. Only if you want to. I don't want to pressure you or make assumptions about what this means or... I silenced him with a kiss, soft and brief but full of affection. When I pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise and hope. I want to stay, I said simply. More than anything. Relief flooded Marcus's features, and his smile could have powered the entire building. Really? Really? He shifted beneath me, reaching for the throw blanket folded over the back of the couch. With careful movements, he arranged it over both of us, tucking it around my shoulders with such tenderness that it made my throat tight. Are you comfortable? He asked, settling back into the cushions with me still curled against his side. Perfect, I murmured, already feeling sleep pulling at the edges of my consciousness. The wine, the emotional intensity of the evening, the warmth of Marcus's embrace, it all combined to make me drowsy despite the magnitude of what had just happened between us. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself drifting in that peaceful space between waking and sleeping. Sleep, Marcus whispered against my temple, his hand resuming its gentle stroking through my hair. I'll be here when you wake up. The promise settled into my bones like warmth, like safety. Like something I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. As consciousness began to slip away, I felt Marcus press a soft kiss to the top of my head, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever complications or fears or uncertainties tomorrow might bring, this moment was worth every risk I'd taken to get here. In the growing quiet of the storm's aftermath, we fell asleep together on his couch, two people who'd spent too many nights alone finally finding solace in each other's arms. Outside, the last of the rain pattered gently against the windows, a lullaby for souls who had discovered that sometimes the most profound changes come not with thunder and lightning, but with whispered confessions and tentative touches in the dark. And if the future remained uncertain, if morning would bring questions neither of us was ready to answer, well, that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, we had this fragile, precious thing growing between us. Tonight, we had each other. And for now, for these few stolen hours, that was more than enough.